Hello everybody, here I am, ready to read. Are you ready to listen? I'm just waiting for something to finish loading on my other monitor, but I shall read. Right, so we are reading the last chapter and a half of The Treasure of the Isle of Mist by W. Tarn. I think he was English, but he married a Scottish lady and he lived a lot of his life in Scotland. He was not an anthropologist, some sort of historian, can't remember what exactly, and into a little bit of philosophy. He specifically focused on ancient Greece, but he wrote one story, and that story he wrote for his daughter, who was in her early teens, and that's this story here, The Treasure of the Isle of Mist. And at some stage, they actually lived on the Isle of Skye, which is the one that often gets referred to as the Isle of Mist. And because of that, she actually ended up moving back there at some stage as an adult. And I wonder if because of this story and whatever the background was they had in their own lives, that he told this particular story, she has become famous for compiling oral tradition fairy stories and other such things especially from various western parts of Scotland. The only books she's ever written, that's what they were, and apparently she is referred to as being an authority on those. So we shall read. I'm just glancing sideways at my lava lamp. It's looking a bit weird at the moment because it's just got started. So we are reading The Treasure of the Isle of Mist by W. Tarn, and we are starting halfway through the second to last chapter, and there's still 22 pages to go of this chapter. She had been at the fairy court and had requested that she could save the urchin. And apparently she sort of jumped in a little bit early. She should have waited until the fairy king had finished what he was saying. So she felt a wave of humiliation pass over her, and she resolved that whatever he was and whatever happened, she would not go home without Jeconiah. Jeconiah was a distant relative. Sorry, I'm just going to change the height on my microphone, and I will mute you for a moment because otherwise it's very noisy. There we go. And that should mean that I just pick up a little bit better without quite so much background noise. So, the charges against Jeconiah were then read: stealing a treasure and being a worthless character. Any defence, said the king? The creature with the head got to work. That was the basically court-appointed lawyer. Lots of brains. Please, Majesty, he said, admit second count, character worthless. Object pity, however, not vindictive punishment. Behalf client offer submit state cure. First count plead not guilty, intention steal treasure admitted but did not succeed. Fiona, in her newfound humility, had been listening to what the creature with the head was saying, and suddenly it dawned on her that all through both he and the king had been trying to help her, so far as was consistent with their own rules, and perhaps the creature with the head, for all his oddity, knew what he was doing. She asked the leprechaun who he was. You might have asked that with advantage before you interrupted him, said the leprechaun severely. He is our chancellor here. He is the king's most intimate friend, and far the ablest lawyer in fairyland. Defence to first count not admitted, the king was saying. Your client cannot plead his own bungling of the theft in mitigation of his wrongdoing. Only the intentions count here. The chancellor looked immensely relieved at the king's words, though it passed Fiona's wit to see why. Apply formal ruling, he said. Take down, this to Whitecap. I hold that nothing counts here but the intention, said the king. Majesty pleases, said the chancellor. Settles point. Retire defence this prisoner. Submit excellent point younger client. We will pass sentence here first, said the king. Jeconiah P. Johnson, your counsel has very properly thrown up his brief. You are convicted of stealing a treasure, and it is admitted that you are a worthless character. On the first count, I sentence you to be handed over to the executioner to be extended until you become a proper size. If you survive, you will then undergo, as offered by your counsel, the state cure at the hands of the state hypnotizer. He turned to the Chancellor. Any further submission? Fiona had gone over to the stack of books and bent down over the little creature with the head. I have made a most terrible mistake, she said in a low voice. I have spoilt everything. I see that you are kind. Can you help us? Should have come me first, said the creature quite gently. Try to attract attention. Never neglect anyone merely because odd and ugly. May have good heart. Sad mess now, but think see daylight. Any influence that boy? Oh, yes, said Fiona eagerly. Right, said the creature. Make boy wish. Now follow my argument. And he turned to the king. Please, Majesty, submit good point. Majesty just ruled nothing counts here but intention. Younger prisoner no intention hurt Shorelark. Therefore on Majesty's ruling same as if did not hurt it. Therefore never was guilty. Human prisoner adjudged not guilty is just same as if came here own free will. So held Majesty's father. And by some extraordinary trick he got the top book open and flopped down among the leaves, from which position he read out bits of an ancient judgment. Consequently, younger prisoner both entitled and bound wish. The king consulted Whitecap. It seems a sound chain of reasoning, he said. Then he turned to the public prosecutor. Have you anything to urge against it? Only that if he wishes wrong, we can't detain him because of the young lady's wish, said that official. Daniel come judgment, cried the Chancellor triumphantly. Heads win, tails can't lose. Younger prisoner wish. He turned to Fiona and whispered to her, Mind he wishes right. Fiona started to go over to the urchin. Instantly the guard crossed their spears before her. No interference allowed with anyone who was going to wish, said the officer. Then she tried to call to him and found that she could not speak. It was like a nightmare. She looked helplessly at the Chancellor. He nodded and spelt on his fingers the word think. Then Fiona understood what he had meant by asking her if she had any influence over the urchin. She knew that she had a good deal, and bits of conversation with her father came back into her mind. She had made one bad blunder, and she had to correct it as best she could, and without more ado she concentrated her whole mind on taking possession of the mind of the urchin. Could it be done at all, and if so, could it be done in time? The king stretched out his sceptre, and there was silence. The young prisoner is going to wish, said the king. Officer? And immediately there appeared in the middle of the ring 6 great boxes, old sea chests made of Spanish chestnut, battered and stained and clamped with bands of iron, and on each was the picture, half obliterated by time and salt water, of the Madonna of the Holy Cross. The officer flung back the lids and showed each chest full to the brim of glittering golden doubloons. That is the treasure from the Venetian galleon which you were seeking, said the king. We removed it long ago into our safe custody, lest it should tempt men, but it would seem that it tempts them none the less. Now wish. The urchin, his eyes bulging out of his head, stared at the shining gold. He murmured, gun, but fortunately so low that the king did not hear him. Fiona kept her eyes fixed hard on the boy and bent every effort of mind and will to the one thought, that he must wish as she wished. If only he would turn round. She had already lost sight of the fairies. She now lost sight of the king. She was conscious only of the abject, wretched creature that was Jeconiah, and of the back of the urchin's head. He was still staring at the gold, but he had not yet spoken. That was to the good, and no, it was not fancy. His ears were turning pink as they always did when he was in a difficulty. Then he began to shuffle his feet uneasily. Fiona felt that every atom of life and force in her was being concentrated on that one act of will. She did not think she could go through with it many seconds longer, or she would collapse. And then the urchin turned his head toward her. His face was scarlet, and his eyes were wavering before the fixed gaze of her own. He must do as she wished. She flung everything into one supreme effort, the last reserves which no one thinks they possess till utter necessity teaches them the contrary. And then the urchin spoke, in a strange voice, and all in one breath. "I want my uncle to go free." Fiona's will let go with a snap. She felt so dizzy that she had to lean against one of the great toadstools or she would have fallen. Round the assemblage ran a sound like the wind through the tree-tops, the noise of thousands drawing in breath at once, and the Chancellor started a war dance on his stack of books, and nearly fell off on his head. The king rose from his throne, but he took no notice of the urchin. He turned straight to Fiona, and bowed to her. "My compliments, young lady," he said. "The prettiest piece of thought transference it has ever been our privilege to see. Where did you learn to do it?" "I never learnt," stammered Fiona. "I made a great mistake, as your Majesty saw, and something had to be done, and your friend suggested this way." "You needn't mind having made a mistake," said the king. "If you don't make mistakes, sometimes you'll never make anything else. And you have made something else this time, with a vengeance. As for you, sirrah," and he shook his fist at the Chancellor. The creature snapped all its fingers in reply. "Majesty pleases," it began triumphantly. "Duty, younger client, submit new point arising young lady's action. Client entitled wish, did not wish himself, young lady wished, therefore client still entitled wish. Propose develop point considerable length with authorities." The king raised his hand. "I think I shall have to intervene," he said. "I believe you would submit points till cockcrow." That's morning. "Submit points till next year, if Majesty pleases," said the creature gleefully. "If these proceedings don't end soon," said the king, "there will be no time to dance, and if we didn't dance, no one knows what would happen to the world above. Even I don't know that. So, as we do not generally have 3 human beings here at once, and as a substantial justice has been done, I propose now to exercise the royal prerogative of generosity. Jeconiah P. Johnson, you will, as requested, go free, so far as we can set you free. We cannot set you free from your own worthless character. In order, however, to do the best for you that can be done, before you leave us, the state hypnotizer will take you in hand and instill into you a few decent feelings. He won't hurt you, and you won't remember. The effect, I fear, will not be permanent, but it will ease our conscience. And as a sign to the world above, that we have treated you liberally, you will find that you will be unable to attend to business until you have told your nephew a fairy tale." Urchin. "A doubt exists as to whether you have had your wish or not. You shall have the benefit of the doubt, so far as it is good for you. You will find that you will get your gun." That implies that the king did hear. And then the king turned to Fiona. "Young lady," he said, "you have given us a display of courage which we are not likely to forget. You have rescued your friend. You have, which is much more to the point, rescued your enemy. You have got 2 wishes out of us, which no one ever did before, and you have asked nothing for yourself. And now what are we to do for you?" "I think I have everything I want now, thank you, your Majesty," said Fiona. "Did we not hear talk of a treasure?" said the king. "Yes," said Fiona, "but I was not thinking about a treasure, your Majesty." "I know," said the king, "but I was, all the time." "I must leave it all in your Majesty's hands," said Fiona. "It is not here," said the king. "What you saw was only a pretence, and we cannot send for it tonight. But if you will honour us some time by returning to our kingdom, we will see what can be done in memory of your visit. Any time you like, and by the front door, please. You will run no risks that way." "And now," said the king, stretching out his sceptre over the great throng, "we will dance." He turned to Fiona and the urchin. "It will be a little while before Mr. Johnson is ready to accompany you home," he said. "Perhaps you will honour us meanwhile by attending the dance also." So the fairies danced before the king, and the fairy ring whirled and blazed with the colour of them, till it was gayer than a gorse bank in blossom, and brighter than a swarm of dragonflies on a June grass field, and more vivid than a fall of shooting stars. And the music that they made was wilder than the wind in the strings of a harp, and sweeter than the blackbird's song, and dearer than all the burns on the moor, murmuring in unison. And the two children sat at the king's feet, on the steps of the beryl throne, and watched the dancers, and the Chancellor sat between them and held Fiona's hand, and told them such stories as they had never heard before, till between laughter and tears they nearly fell off the steps of the throne, and the Chancellor laughed and cried with them for sheer joy in his own storytelling. And if there were 3 happier people in the world that night, I do not know where they were. And the night itself passed away as a dream, when men dream, and its hours seemed to them but as a few minutes, and then across the music and the dance cut the shrill, harsh scream of a peacock as he greeted the day. The children saw the king rise from his throne and stretch his sceptre out over the ring, and the ring and the dancers were shrouded in a white mist, which rose from the ground and wreathed its arms about them, and the beryl throne dissolved in the mist, and the figure of the king above them, pointing, grew dim and huge and spread and grew a purple shadow that hung over them, and they were standing alone in the fairy ring on Glen Olistal, under the purple sky, with the white mist wreathing itself about their feet, and the pale November dawn coming slowly up out of the sea. Did the urchin fling himself on the grass at Fiona's feet and thank her in broken accents for all she had done for him? I regret to state that the first thing which the urchin did was to feel in his pocket and draw out the doubloon which he had found in the cave. "I got this one anyhow, Fiona," he said, "but I wonder how I'm going to get that gun." Then something seemed to prick him. He began to look uncomfortable and shuffle his feet, while his ears turned pink, and at last he managed to blurt out, "I say, Fiona, it was jolly decent of you, you know." Fiona only smiled, the wise smile of perfect understanding. That morning the doctor was hastily summoned with the news that Jeconiah was awake. The nurse met him in the passage, wide-eyed and rather frightened. "He's so strange," she said. Said the doctor. "Told you he might wake like that. Kind of change in personality? Just so. Often happens. Seldom permanent, though. What's he done?" Sorry, my mouth is slightly dry. "Well, doctor, of course we all know Mr. Johnson's reputation," said the nurse. "He's thanked me 3 times, and hoped I didn't tire myself. He had all the servants up and said he'd see their wages were raised, and the cook gave notice on the spot because she said she didn't like practical jokes, and he says he wants to go out and gather buttercups and daisies and play with the little frogs, and he's sent for some old gun that he says he's got to buy for his nephew, and he hasn't opened any of the telegrams that have been waiting for him. He says he mayn't attend to business till he has learnt a fairy tale, and he's had the library ransacked, and he's tearing his hair because there's no such thing in it." "Oh, well," said the doctor, "we must just have patience, nurse. I expected something of the sort. Just humour him. If you can't find a fairy tale, try him with a history book. He'll never know the difference, and I'll send him up a nice soothing mixture. Very interesting case. Very interesting." And the doctor, calling up his best professional smile, bustled into Jeconiah's room. Sorry, excuse me, I've got a bit of a sore neck at the moment. I've got a migraine, and one of the things that happens when I have a migraine is I get an extra tight muscle with an ache in it on the side of my neck. So I was just trying to stretch it out a bit. I'll carry on. We haven't quite finished the chapter yet. It was the same afternoon, a still afternoon of Indian summer, that the old hawker, accompanied again by the black terrier, was going down the shore road. He must have had business at the cottage on the beach, but his business was probably not urgent, for he stopped to watch with interest a group on the shore. It consisted of Jeconiah and the urchin, and they sat on the little patch of sand at the mouth of the burn. The urchin had across his knees the rusty old gun bought for him by Jeconiah, who had nevertheless exacted the doubloon from him in exchange. He fingered the gun lovingly while he gazed with undisguised impatience at the proceedings of his uncle. Jeconiah's coat lay on the ground beside a sheaf of unopened telegrams, and he was putting the finishing touches to a noble castle of sand. Its drawbridge was supported by his double watch chain, and its turrets bore a suspicious resemblance in contour to the inside of his hat. He patted his work and gazed at it with pride. "Fine, isn't it?" he said. "You'd better hurry up with that fairy tale," said the boy. "If you've got to, you've got to, you know, and you won't keep me much once I get some cartridges." Jeconiah looked alarmed. "But I haven't found one yet," he said, and glanced anxiously at the pile of telegrams. "Make one up then," said the boy. "Anybody can do that." Thus adjured, Jeconiah started. Once upon a time there was a very grisly old bear, and he lived in a beautiful place called Capel Court, and he used to hunt the wild bulls and the stags and the poor little guinea pigs that abounded in that salubrious locality. And there were 2 young ladies there called Cora and Dora. "Are those the princesses?" asked the boy. "No, I think not," said Jeconiah. "They were of quite ordinary stock. Well, the old bear thought they were too high and mighty, and that he would like to take them down a point or two." "Oh, this won't do," said the urchin rudely. "This isn't a real fairy tale at all. You must do something better than that." The wretched Jeconiah groaned and looked again at his telegrams. Then he started afresh. "Once upon a time there was a great dragon with 7 heads, and he ate 7 princesses every day for dinner." "That's better," said the boy encouragingly as he settled himself to listen. The old hawker resumed his walk. "They haven't made a very good job of him after all," he remarked aloud, apparently to the terrier, "but I expect that sort is incurable." Was it a flicker of sunlight, or did the black terrier really wink? And that's the end of that chapter, and I am having a drink of water because I need one now. So how are you doing? Have you been up to anything interesting? I live in New Zealand, which I commonly refer to as NZ, E-N-Z-E-D, because that's how we say the letter Z. And we've just gone into level 4 lockdown for a week. Well, the rest of New Zealand has gone into level 4 lockdown for 3 days. And the region that I live in, that's Auckland and also the Coromandel, have gone into lockdown for a week, maybe more, because we had a case of COVID in the community, and we haven't had one since quite a long time ago. And so instead of just letting it run rampant, we are locked down. We have to stay home. Only essential workers are allowed to go to work. We can go to the supermarket, we can get fuel for the vehicle and a couple of other things, but otherwise we've got to stay at home in our little bubbles. That a bubble is a group of people that you are with, that you are safe with, and you are not transferring any possibility of infection between your bubble and someone else's bubble. So that's what we're up to at the moment. And for some people that means that they're having a nice quiet time because they're not going to work, and others because they are already able to work from home, such as my daughter and me. We are still carrying on doing our normal thing, and everybody else says, "Oh, wasn't it lovely having a nice quiet break?" And we're going like, there's nothing different to it. But anyway, and did you know I started doing these readings in our first New Zealand lockdown? Our first level 4 lockdown was in March 2020, and New Zealand went into lockdown for a month. I think it was a month. And so I decided I wanted something interesting to do that was for people outside of my home. And I remembered having read stories myself, having had them read to me, and also reading them to my children when they were little, about a little girl called Millie Molly Mandy. And that was the start of Jev's story time. I started reading old stories, and I read them all through our lockdown, and I carried on for a little while afterwards until I'd finished all of the ones I could get hold of at the time. And then I completed them, so I have read all of the Millie Molly Mandy stories written by Joyce Lancaster Brisley. And if you want to listen to them, they're over on my YouTube channel, which is listed down below, and I shall type it into the box for you as well. And there's a playlist over on my channel, which is in that link there, which you've just seen. And they're younger stories than the rest of the ones I've read, just because I've found it very hard to find anything else of that standard for that age group from that time period, because I love reading old stories, ones that were printed a long time ago. They may still be in print, but they are no longer in their original copyright, so they're in public domain. And so I have continued reading after a bit of a break, but the ones I've been reading more recently are ones for older children, which I enjoy, and so do a lot of other adults. They're great for listening to if you want to have a bedtime story. You don't have to be a child to have a bedtime story. They're also great to listen to as if you are listening to an audiobook. And there are people who listen to them over on YouTube. They will put on a playlist and listen their way through, which means that they get to listen to us chatting away about various things. And I'm going to carry on reading with the last chapter of The Treasure of the Isle of Mist. And my book says it's 43 pages, but I happen to know it won't be. It'll be a lot shorter than that, because when you download a book from Gutenberg.org, Gutenberg.org, because it has been transcribed from the original, from one of the original printed versions of a book that is in public domain, they put in information about the work that has been done to bring it to you digitally at the end of the book. And for some reason, they haven't thought to separate that out from the chapters. So it means that the chapter count for the last chapter, the page count for the last chapter, is not so good. Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for joining us. Now, one of the things you can also do is you can actually join our Discord server. There's not a lot happening there, but the more people we have joining, the more interesting it'll get. One of the ideas I have for the Discord server is if anyone finds any pictures online that are relevant for the stories we're reading, please share them there. And if you've got ideas for further books for me to read, that would be great too. No promises, but I will see what I can do. But like I say, I like reading old-fashioned books, old-fashioned stories. And at some stage, I will be sorting through my boxes of old books and reading to you from physical books, not digital books. So at the moment, I read using an old first-generation iPad mini, which still works. It's wonderful. It's no good for anything else. I can't even put apps on it anymore because it's too old. But it's brilliant for being able to download books and read them. So it's like having a Kindle or something like that, but just slightly bigger. Anyway, and I love being able to use technology that has been superseded, but rather than throwing it away, it can still be put to use. So I'm going to carry on reading. We are reading the last chapter of The Treasure of the Isle of Mist by W.W. Tarn, and it is chapter 8, and it's called Fiona Finds Her Treasure. Remember, that's what started. The story was she was looking for a treasure. And Fiona sat on the hearthrug in the book room and told her father the whole story from beginning to end, as it has been told here. And sometimes he asked a question, and sometimes he said yes, that would be so, and sometimes he stroked her hair and said nothing. And when she had ended, he said, "So you never found your own treasure after all, Fiona?" She said, "I suppose I can have it now if I go back." "Do you think you will go back?" he asked. She replied with another question. "Have you found out what my treasure is, Daddy?" "I believe I could guess," he answered, "but you have found a good many things already apart from treasure, haven't you, little daughter?" She sat silent and looked into the fire. "I suppose I have," she said. We won't enumerate them, said the student. That's the story's nickname for her father. It spoils things entirely sometimes to put them into words, but I will tell you something an old writer once said. He was talking of that particular kind of treasure which men call truth, and he said that if he were offered truth itself on the one hand and the everlasting search for it on the other hand, he would choose the search. I expect you can understand that now, for you have seen what has happened to you over your own search. I think I can understand, said Fiona. I must be growing older, Daddy. You'll be too old soon to go back to fairyland at all, little daughter, said the student. If you are going, you will have to go at once. What do you think, Daddy? She questioned. I can only tell you that, in my case, I went back. The student answered. Why, Daddy, have you been to fairyland too? Cried Fiona. And you never told me? Yes, said the student. Even a musty old scholar like myself was young once, you know. And he looked into the fire with eyes which seemed to see things very, very far away. It was not quite the same as the fairyland you have been in, Fiona, but we called it fairyland. Can't you come back with me if I go, Daddy? Asked the girl. I'm too old now, little daughter, he said. For good or for bad, I could never find the way again. I can only see it now through your eyes. I'll come as far as the door with you, and that's all that an old man can do. I suppose you know where the door is? I never felt there was any doubt, said Fiona. Then we'll start first thing tomorrow, if it's calm enough. But that evening was the last of the golden autumn, and when Fiona awoke in the morning, the Isle of Mist was justifying its name. The southwest gale was raging round the house like a live animal, seizing it and shaking it and wailing in the chimneys pitifully like an unburied ghost, and before the gale the long lead-coloured rollers were racing in from the Atlantic, smashing themselves on the crags and shooting up heavenward in columns of spray thrice the height of the cliffs, while the noise of the surf in the Scargill cave came booming across the water like the roar of a battleship's guns. The hills were all shrouded in mist, and the mist was fine salt rain that rolled in from the sea, driving in billows over the moor and across the fields. The gulls were tossed about in it like bits of waste paper, and every green thing on the island opened its heart to the rain and drank till it could drink no more. Toward evening, Fiona and the student, in oilskins and sou'westers, went down to that's a raincoat and a rain hat. Went down to the rocks and out seaward as far as possible, and there stood, unable to speak for the noise. They balanced themselves against the gusts and felt the tingling drops of salt spray rattle like hail off their coats, while they watched the cliff waterfalls, unable to fall for the wind, go straight up and heavenwards in clouds of smoke, and the sea foam and tear at the rocks below, and once for a moment the cloud mist parted, and the hills started out, their dark sides all gashed and seamed with white streaks, where every tiny runlet and burn was rushing in spate down towards the sea. Fiona managed to shout with her clear young voice, "No one can really love this island who only knows it in summer." And then they went home, out of the dusk and the lashing of the wet wind, to the quiet book-room and tea things and lamps and books. For man may love nature, but he loves still better the contrast between nature and the things which he has fashioned for himself. Excuse me, I've got an itchy nose. That's another thing that happens to me when I have a migraine. Sorry about that. For 3 weeks the wind blew, and though there were days when the sea mist lifted, there was no day on which the sea was calm enough for the launching of their small boat. Then one afternoon came change. The warm air turned chill, and the warm rain became sleet. That night the wind backed to the north, and the next day was a blizzard of snow, and the night after the wind fell away and the snow ceased, and Orion and his 2 dogs shone huge in a frosty sky. And Fiona woke to the glories of a scarlet sunrise on a great field of white. "We must hurry, Daddy," she said. "It's perfectly calm." "It's a pet day," said the student, sniffing the air. "It won't last. The wind backed too suddenly, but it's all right till sunset." Directly breakfast was over, they launched the little boat and started. The snow shone white in the sunshine, and the calm sea against the snow was as blue as a blue lotus, but the shadows on the snow were a wonder, and the woven complexity of their colourings would have taxed every hue on an artist's palette. So they pulled down and into the cave, at whose mouth the great bluff looked barer and blacker than ever against the world's whiteness, and they grounded their boat and climbed the rock barrier. That means they've gone all the way into the cave. There the student sat down and filled and lit his pipe. "This is as far as I can go," he said. "If I mistake not, you will find that they have opened the door for you." So Fiona went on to the recess where the urchin had found the doubloon, and where the torch had been smashed in her father's hand, and the solid wall of the cliff had opened. And there was an archway leading into the black vaulting of the long cave behind. Fiona passed through into the darkness, and the darkness parted to right and left of her. And she stood again in the fairy ring where she had stood on All Hallows Eve. But how changed! Of all the bright throng of fairies that had clustered round it, not one stood there today. The circle of scarlet toadstools was broken down and shattered, as though by a great storm, and the ring itself was no longer grass, but was covered in deep snow. Of all the things she had seen there that evening, only one remained. The beryl throne stood lonely in the midst of the bare ring, and on the throne sat the King of Fairies. His face rested on his hand as though he were deep in thought. His eyes were looking at something far away. On the steps of the throne sat the Chancellor, the King's inseparable friend, and he too was deep in thought. It was a view of the fairy world which Fiona had never expected. The King must have heard her step, for he rose from his throne and came down to meet her. "Have you come for your treasure, Fiona?" he said, and she said, "I have come because you asked me to come back." The King held out his sceptre to her, and again the mist came up from the ground and enwrapped the beryl throne, and the figures of the King and the Chancellor wavered and became dim before her. Were they the King and the Chancellor? Was not what she saw so dim through the mist? The figures of the shepherd who had helped her on Glen Ollistal and his black collie? But the mist was wavering again about them, and again all was a blur, and then the mist suddenly cleared, and there was no one there at all, but just the old hawker and the little terrier which followed him. "So you were the King of the Fairies all the time," said Fiona. "All the time," said the old man gently. "We go about in the world as you see us, and some still entertain angels unaware. Have you come for your treasure, Fiona?" And this time Fiona answered, "Yes." "You have earned it," said the King, "and you have found much more than any treasure. Your father has told you that?" And again Fiona said, "Yes." "I cannot really give you your treasure," said the King, "for you have it already. I think you have had it all the time, but you did not know. But now you have learned." "What is it?" asked Fiona. "But I think I can guess now." "It is the spirit of the island which you love," said the King, "and which henceforth loves you. You have spoken face to face with bird and beast, and with the beings who knew and loved the land before your race was. Today you have the freedom of the island, and of all living things in it. They are your friends forever. And to the dead in its graveyards you are kin. All that is there has passed into your blood, the long-lost loves, the old impossible loyalties, the old forgotten heroisms and tendernesses. All these are yours, and yours are the songs that were sung long ago, and the tales which were told by the fireside, and the deeds of the men and women of old have become part of you. You can walk now through the crowded city and never know it, for the wind from the heather will be about you where you go. You can stand in the tumult of men and never hear them, for round you will be the silence of your own sea. That is the treasure of the Isle of Mist. The island has given you of its soul. You have found greater things already. You will find greater things yet again. But such as it is the best gift which we of the fairy world have to give. And now," continued the King, "you will not see us again. I will take back the bracelet. It would be no further use to you, for you are no longer a child. You are too old for fairyland." "But my father could see you," said Fiona. "He could only see me as I really am through your eyes," said the king. "It may be that some day you too will see me again through the eyes of a child, but for the present it is farewell." So Fiona stooped down and stroked the little dog, who looked at her with wistful eyes, and took her farewell of the king. And the king raised his hand, and the mist rose again and enwrapped the fairy ring and those in it, and Fiona walked out through the archway into the cave. And there sat the student on the rock barrier, just as she had left him, knocking the ashes out of his pipe. And even as she came to him, there was a noise behind her, and when she looked round, it was to see the archway blocked by a great fall of rock. "You will not use that way again, little daughter," said the student. "I shall not use any way again now, Daddy," she said. "I am too old. But, oh, Daddy, it has been worth it." Then they launched their boat and paddled slowly out of the cave, out of the dark into daylight, and before them lay the quiet sea bathed in the winter sun, and the Isle of Mist, dreaming under its mantle of white. The end.